It's been a while since I've made a tutorial like this, and this time it's actually not for the musicians, but for the game developers. I've gained quite some experience finding jobs and answering to job offers, and I've pretty much seen it all. I've worked for game developers that are easy to work with, and I've worked for game developers that are harder to work with. I'll talk about when to search for a composer, who's the right composer for your project, what to expect from a composer, how to find a good composer or how to construct a job offering post, and resources to give the composer, along with an example form. It's usually best to only get a composer when you are either serious about your project or want to gather some experience managing a team and want to meet fellow beginners to forge some connections and get more people on the team to have more input. You can also get one after the game is already done with placeholder music. In less experienced teams, it's best to get a composer rather early, since he may be able to help shaping the game and provide feedback. If you're a more experienced team, then you should hire a composer later to make sure that you have enough material gathered that you can show the composer, to fuel his inspiration and give him some ideas on what kind of music or techniques might work best, and to show that the game production is stable and it won't get abandoned shortly after. Usually companies hire the composer after at least 50% of the game is done. For indies, it would probably be best to hire them after the basic gameplay functions are programmed or the script is partly done, especially if you're planning to have a Kickstarter or to get a publisher, since being able to show a few great tracks might actually get some music enthusiasts to pledge for your project, or tell the publisher that you've already found a good composer. There are countless different types of composers, but for simplicity's sake, I'll boil them together into three categories: beginners or hobbyists, intermediate, and professionals. The proficiency of the composer that you want to hire correlates to your own experience with developing games. If you're a beginner or hobbyist yourself who just wants to get some more experience in game development or doesn't expect to make big money from the game, then it would be best to hire a beginner or hobbyist composer as well. Oftentimes they are under the age of 18 or have another stable form of income, meaning they aren't dependent on the money they are making with the music. The quality of the music is of course not assured, since they usually haven't gathered enough experience or knowledge yet, and don't own expensive equipment, but they will usually make the music for free or for a very low price. Rev share is usually accepted as well. If you are an intermediate game dev who's serious about his project or has already published a few titles, then you might want to hire an intermediate composer who can compose for indie prices. They might partly be hobbyists who don't mainly make their money through composing music, but they usually have the equipment and experience to justify demanding more money for their services. The prices can range from $50 to $500 per music minute, which is a huge leap considering that $500 is a ton for an indie dev, but those composers that work for indie prices that are closer to $500 oftentimes have or had big company positions and lower their prices to suit indie developers to have a broader clientele. Rev share might be accepted, but it would depend on the quality of the project and how promising it seems. If you are a professional, then you usually won't need this guide, but maybe you're just curious or have the luck to have enough money through some source to afford a professional composer. Professional composers demand $500 to $1,000 and upwards per music minute, $1,000 being the standard AAA price. There isn't much to tell about them except that they usually have a ton of industry experience and are able to make a high quality soundtrack. Those prices are just rough estimates though. If you're wondering why music is so expensive, to become a composer you don't only need to study it for 4 years or so, you need at least 10 or 15 years of musical experience. Most composers start learning an instrument or composing at the age of 10, some earlier, some later, till you're in a position where you can demand a reasonable amount of money for your music. You also have to take their equipment into account, which is quite expensive. My own equipment comes up to around $6,000 and I still don't have everything I need. Most professional setups cost around $20,000. Making music also doesn't just involve the creative process like composition and arrangement and punching notes into a piano roll, but also includes technicalities like mastering and equalizing to bring out the best sound possible. Okay, what can you expect from a composer? This again depends on the person, but usually composers, like artists in general, are, or at least should be, okay with constructive feedback, meaning that you can easily ask for changes if something doesn't sound right. There's a big but though. Don't overdo it. Having to revise a piece thousands of times is the bane of every artist and kills motivation. If it happens too often, unless it's really minor changes, then it means that you've made the wrong choice and hired the wrong person. They will then usually tell you that their style doesn't work with your vision and that you should hire someone else instead so that you don't waste each other's time. In a more professional environment, composers will either get paid for any additional changes made to the pieces or limit their possible changes to a certain amount, like 3 is a reasonable number. Related to that is that you can't usually expect the composer to read your mind and exactly know what you mean if you give them cryptic or subjective instructions. Something like, it doesn't sound enough like a funeral scene. It needs to sound more like a funeral. Doesn't make much sense. I, for example, accompany funerals regularly with a brass quintet, and pieces like Amazing Grace or Von Guten Mächten, played by a brass ensemble, is what funeral sounds like to me. While he might not want a brass ensemble, but a core or strings. But it's hard to know that from a direction like make it sound more like a funeral. Other than that, video game composers are usually quite diverse and can compose in many different genres, so you shouldn't be afraid to ask if they can make something in a different genre for a scene if it demands it, like a scene where a player plays an arcade classic, which needs 8-bit music while the rest of the score is orchestral. Composers usually have certain genres they excel at, so it's best to stick to those, but most won't have a problem with composing a theme in a genre they don't compose in regularly. Hiring an extra composer for one track would be too much work anyhow. Some composers might also have some experience in game development or the theory behind implementing music into video games, like how some tracks could be made more interactive and become part of the gameplay mechanics, so some might be able to offer advice in that direction. So try to be open to advice of that kind, since the composer you've hired is usually pretty much the expert on everything regarding audio on your team, unless you have an audio director. But how do you go about finding a composer? Browsing through the jobs section of a game dev themed forum might help you. Many composers post up demo reels in these forums and name the genres they are most experienced at. If they don't, then checking out their reel will give you some insight. Another option would be to go through the credits of games that have a similar soundtrack that you want for your project and Google the composer to find his contact info. If you'd rather construct a post and have people apply to you, then make sure to include the following. If it's a paid, unpaid or revenue share position, revenue share doesn't equal paid since payment isn't secured if the game gets cancelled or flops. What your budget is, scale of the project, how far the game is into development, how many pieces are approximately needed, what genre of music you want for your project, and especially what your project is about with screenshots or videos of it, if possible. You can of course include anything else that you think might be necessary or important. In the description is a small link list to get you started. There you will find opportunities to send in your own job offer posts or check out the posts of various musicians. It's best to construct a list of all the composers with pros and cons and their info to make deciding easier when you have narrowed down a selection. Things to look out for would be their price, their preferred genres and genre range, depending on how many different genres you expect your project to need, the quality of their pieces, and of course, how much you like their style. If you're making an RPG and know that there will be a huge desert section where you definitely want oriental sounding music, then you should ask the composer beforehand if he's comfortable with that genre. Same goes for specific ethnic styles like traditional Japanese or Russian music, since he'd need to have the virtual or real life instruments to be able to emulate these genres convincingly. The quality of the pieces might be a bit harder to make out if you're not into audio. Terms like equalization, compression and normalization might not mean much to you, so it would be best to either contact someone you know who could give an honest evaluation, preferably not a rival composer who applied for the same position, so the evaluation is more objective, or depend on your own hearing to make out if a piece sounds good or not. Some basic indications to a badly manufactured piece might be the instruments sound fake, which of course only applies to real-world instruments, not synths. There's distortion that sounds out of place. Some genres like lo-fi hip-hop has static in the background though, which is part of the genre. Some instruments are way too loud and you have to turn the volume down or up at some points. This might mean that it's not mastered properly, or it sounds mashed together and the individual instruments are hard to make out, which might mean that the instruments weren't panned appropriately or weren't equalized to avoid that problem. If you're looking for a cheap composer, then you'll have to live with these quality deficiencies, since a good composer who knows his stuff will demand more than an amateur. You're giving him a chance to improve himself though on the bright side and forge a connection that might help you in the future when he's more experienced. You gotta remember that knowledge in music theory might not be a deciding factor in some cases. It really depends on the genre of music you want for the project. If you want orchestral music, then the composer having a lot of music theory knowledge will be more necessary than if you want electronic music, in which case knowledge about technical things like effects is more important. Knowing whether or not you want to hire additional live performers or like singers or instrumentalists, since computer generated instruments don't always sound that great, helps too, so you can put composers who can play these instruments or sing higher on your list. There's one very important step that you shouldn't forget though, that doesn't only apply to composers, but to all people who reply to a job posting of yours. Sending confirmation emails to the people who applied if you know that it will take a while to look through all applications, preferably with a rough estimate as to how long it will approximately take you, so they know you've received their message. And when you've chosen a composer, telling the ones that haven't been chosen that you've chosen someone. Not notifying them at all is quite unprofessional and can cause quite some trouble to the composers if they are refraining from sending out job applications because they are waiting for your response, therefore costing them potential commissions. Okay, now you found a composer and just need to send him everything he needs for his job. He will usually tell you what he needs, but it's good to be prepared. So here's what most composers will want from you. Gameplay samples, the game design document, screenshots, additional info on the game that you couldn't share in your post, and a list of all the needed pieces. Especially the latter might surprise some people. Many indie composers won't mind not having a complete list from the start, but having one will help them quite a lot, and yourself too actually, to make sure that you have an overview of your music budget. That list should include the setting or situation this piece will be used in, the length of it, maybe additional instructions, and sample pieces that sound like what you want that piece to sound like. Some game developers like naming their pieces themselves, and if you're one of them, make sure to include the name of the song so the composer doesn't have to rename his files later on. If you've gone for the option of giving the composer a lot of freedom, then you can leave the construction of the list to him. Here's an example form. The name of the piece would be Eastern Winds. It will be used for a Japan-inspired character, like this one. And the additional info is the link to the art. And info like should include the eru as main instrument because she plays that instrument. Eru is a traditional Asian instrument. And that it should be rather calm and melancholic. The length would be 2 minutes, and these are a few samples how they would like it to sound. Having a list like this for every piece you need for a game will make the work process of the composer way more efficient, and he won't have to ask for additional info all the time. And that pretty much concludes it. If you have any more questions, leave them in the comments and I'll gladly answer them. And if you want to add something to this list, then write a comment as well. I might have missed a few things. Alright, see ya.